Welcome everybody. And so first of all, you have your download for today, if you have obviously downloaded that already. So today's lesson episode is going to be vases for cakes and display. Okay, and so we're going to Scott's going to bring in the camera here, so on the overhead camera, there we go. So this is the vases for cakes and display, and so this is going to be really like a second part of like last week's class. Last week's episode was basket toppers, and this is another alternative to baskets, but it's similar but a little bit different in using styrene shapes to create different shaped vases. And so I'm going to be showing you and start off with like creating a posy bowl shape. So the posy bowl shape I'm going to do is I'm going to do this in Wedgwood style. Now this is Jasper ware. So Jasper ware is a Wedgwood. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But of course this type of posy bowl you could do in metallics, you could obviously airbrush, you could sponge. So you could do this to look like a pottery bowl. You could do this also in terracotta using some of the like a Kerry's mold. You could do sort of like a little like I'm going to show on the flower pot. You could do some of those details. So you could actually use some of the molds to do this all in like terracotta. So that would be really nice, like say on a summer outside garden wedding. Okay, so it's really just showing you a concept, and then you can of course run with the ideas there. And in air drying clay as well, this is a really nice one to use for like a table centerpiece, or as I said, you could do this again on top of a cake. Now, and that's going to be the first project, and then I'm going to then go on to show you how to make a little flower pot. So I'm going to show you how to make a flower pot. And again, this could be used obviously on a birthday cake. You could do this in sugar, which I've got here, or in air drying clay. And I'm going to show you how we use that. And then actually also that uses like the smaller part left from when we did the basket from the styrofoam cone. And then I'm also going to show you how to do pressed sugar. So the vase actually that's on the front of the your download there, that is actually made from pressed sugar, where we actually take sugar and vinegar and you make it like damp sand, and you can pack that into different shapes. And you can make vases and bowls and all sorts of things there, and they can be decorated with royal icing, or as it talks about when we come on to that, you could also use as an alternative instead of using styrofoam. So some of you might not have access to all the different styrofoam shapes and things, so you can actually just make sugar ones and cover them. They would be a little bit heavier, but that's an alternative you could also use. Okay, so anyway, so we're going to start off with the posy bowl vase. So this is perfect for a round arrangement. So this was actually designed, this particular cake here, this was actually the topper of a cake, and so this is actually was done from a wedding cake class I taught several years ago, actually about 10 years ago this class was. But this is the vase I created to go with the sort of periwinkle blue hydrangeas, the pink roses, the obviously lilac, we've got lily of the valley. Of course this is pre-Flower Pro, but this is of course all of these things are possible with the ultimate filler flower mold, and obviously you know your roses and things like that. But as I said, this is made in a sort of a posy bowl shape. So a posy bowl would be like for a round arrangement. So this is, as I said, this is it's not exactly the same one from the cake, but one I did for another class. But this just gives you an idea about what it would look from the top, all right? This is quite old. As I said, this is over 10 years old, this particular topper. But as you can see here, this gives you the sort of the idea of this style of topper. So when we talk about a posy, all right, a posy is this round, almost like a half ball shape. And a lot of brides carry posies. And we talked a little bit about posies in the wiring episode, okay? But a posy gets its name from obviously that sort of shape. And actually the nursery rhyme, ring a roses, a pocket full of posies, tissue, tissue, we all fall down, comes from the time during the Great Plague in England, where ladies would walk around with a posy, or what is called in Victorian time a nosegay, all right? And it got its name nosegay because gay is like nice and smells nice, and nose, it came obviously from the plague. The actual nosegay got its name from, obviously they was fragrant. Obviously not having been alive at that time, I would imagine that the smell wasn't very pleasant. So the thing is that the ladies would walk around with these sort of posies of flowers. And so, as I said, sort of nosegay, posy, that all comes from Victorian times, and actually through the plague and things. But as you can see here, this shows the topper. So when you're creating that, basically you're going to be doing that in like everything will be in 4s or in 8s. So you know I've got like 4 full roses here, and I have 1 mid-size rose, and then I have obviously 4 clumps of hydrangeas, I have 4 lilac, I have 4 lily of the valley. I also have, as I said, some lily of the valley down here as well. So basically when the students made this, they made everything in sort of 4s or 8s, and of course 1 mid-rose as a center part. After the video, I will take some photographs of the head down on that, so you've just got that for reference, all right? But it just gives you a little bit of an idea about what a posy, or as I said, nosegay looks like, okay? So anyway, so we're going to do this, we're going to use similar technique to that we used last week, in that we're going to use so we're going to use styrofoam ball sizes are approximate. So I'm using a 96 millimeter, or about 3 3/4 to 4 inch styrofoam ball. It depends, like, you know, those of you here in the US, when you go into Michael's, Joann's, Hobby Lobby, they all use different manufacturers. So sometimes it will say 4 inch, sometimes it will be 3 3/8 or whatever. But anyway, it's just approximately about a 96 to 100 millimeter, 3 3/4 to 4 inch size ball. And then what you're going to do is very similar to the way we did this last week, and I've already done this, and I think most of you have obviously already watched. So you're just going to use a serrated knife. So you're going to cut the end off of the ball, okay? So you're just going to slice off just a little piece off the ball, okay? And then you're going to then measure 65 millimeters, all right? 2 1/4 inches, okay? So you're going to do, as I said, about 2 1/4 inches, about 65 millimeters. So you're going to measure with your tape measure, and you're going to do that all the way around. You're going to cut that. So you see, we're not cutting this in half, because we actually want this to be a little bit more than half, all right? Now, of course, once you've seen this concept, you could change the size of the balls you use, and also the depth of the vase as well. You might want to make it a little bit deeper. You may want to make it a little bit more shallow. All right, so this is actually the piece we're going to use for the main part of the vase or posy bowl. And then you repeat with a 76 millimeter one. So then what I've done here is, this is basically a 3 inch ball. So again, what I've done there is cut the end off, and then I've just measured there. As I said on that one, you've measured here about 30 millimeters, or about 1 1/4 inches. All right, so about 1 1/4 or 30 millimeters you're going to measure here. So this is what we're going to use for the 2 parts of the posy bowl, all right? Now just try and get your cuts even, but the thing is, don't worry too much if the top is not perfect, because that will be evened up when we put the strip and things around it, okay? Now just remember, styrofoam has a habit of, obviously, you get these little particles, so just, you know, sometimes work on paper, so you can just obviously get rid of that, because you don't really want to get that into your, especially with paste, with sugar paste and fondant, you don't want to get that into there. All right, now, so once you've cut that, we're then going to take 170 grams, which is 6 ounces of rolled fondant, or if you're using air drying clay, about 60 grams. And then for Wedgwood Jasper color, see the next section. So on the next section there, it's got the Jasperware. So Jasperware, this is Jasperware, so, all right, so this is Wedgwood Jasperware, all right, and this is the color I've made to match this, all right. Now, when I make this is unfortunately a little bit of a, you have to play around a little bit. When I make this in classes, because I've used this when I teach some of my like cookie classes, I've done like Jasperware. You can see I've done like Jasperware cookies. So these are some ones with cherubs on, and as I said, Cameo, the Katie Sue Cameo. This is the Creative Cake System. This is the Rose Medley by Kerry. But when we do Jasperware, Jasperware comes in many colors, but the blue is the most popular. So what when I sort of make this color, and of course it doesn't necessarily have to be exact, I mean, but basically what I've done is I've used a purple, so I used a high precision scale, 3 grams of Chef Master No Fade purple, 1 gram of royal blue, and then 1/2 gram of rainbow dust gray. All right, so basically it's a sort of a purple, blue, and a little bit of gray. All right, so you can just play around with it. But of course, you know, this is just giving you an idea about making it as a sort of a china vase. You could also do this like Royal Albert, you know, like for example, Royal Albert's very famous one is a rose one. My grandparents had that, my nanny and granddad, with the sort of the yellow and sort of reddy burgundy colored roses on. So you could do this in white, and you could paint this, all right, so if you're good at painting. So there's lots and lots of ways of taking inspiration from different china patterns and sugar bowls and things like that, and then just sort of creating that in, as I said, with painting, with piping, with paste, whatever. But anyway, so that's how you get the Jasperware color. And as I said, so we've got 170 grams of that, which I have here. And so what I'm going to do here is then I'm going to add 1/4 teaspoon of Tylose and vegetable shortening fat to this amount, okay? Now, This is going to just modify the fondant, all right, because, and then another, when I actually taught this in my class, what I did is I used like 70% fondant, 30% gum paste. And so this will give you a similar technique. We're just going to add 1/4 teaspoon of the tylose to the 170 grams of paste there. And then we're going to put in a comparable amount of vegetable fat here. All right, and of course the air drying clay, you're just using air drying clay, but just with the sugar one, because the sugar paste is a little bit softer, we're just going to just put the tylose in here. Now when we, a little later on, when we talk about the top of the, doing the decorations on here, it has the normal formula for modifying fondant, like for your pine cone molds and things like that. We normally use 115 grams to 1/4 teaspoon. So I'm using a little bit more fondant here with less, you know, the tylose is just a little bit less than would normally be. So this is just going to give a little bit of body to the product. Once we've done that, we're going to then, so you're going to add your teaspoon, and then you're going to then roll out 2/3 of the paste to, so you're going to just take about 2/3 of your paste approximately. All right, so I'm just going to take about 2/3 of my paste. And we're going to roll this out. So this is going to be rolled out here to approximately 20 centimeters, or about an 8-inch circle. Now you're going to do this straight away. And what this will mean is that once this has been put onto the styrofoam shape, this will help it dry a little bit more quickly. You could use straight fondant, but the thing is going to take a little bit longer to dry. All right, now you're just going to just roll out your paste. And want to try and keep this as round as possible, because if it ends up like the shape of England or the Florida Keys, you know, it's going to not be the right shape. So you're just going to make this out. And see, I'm just stretching this. So you just hold your rolling pin and you're just actually stretching out with your rolling pin here. I forgot to get my little needle or pin out, but if you do get a little air bubble, just go in there with a little needle. Okay, so you want to just, so this wants to be rolled out, so this wants to be about 20 centimeters or about 8 inches across. Okay, now we're going to, once we've done that, this is obviously your top edge, so this is always like if you're covering a cake, would be the side that's going to be on top. All right, so you're now going to then, once we've done that, going to turn over. All right, so we're going to turn over and we're going to spread some piping gel onto there. So you can just take some piping gel. Just going to put some piping gel onto here. I'm going to put a little bit of piping gel. Now you can also use corn syrup. All right, you could even use, like for this, you could even use honey as well. I mean, it's basically something that's sticky. But edible glue, the reason why I'm not using edible glue here is edible glue is going to be a little bit more watery. So you want something that's got a little bit of body to it. You see, I'm just going to use my little flexi scraper. Now, I've been using this flexi scraper for a lot of different projects, and it's wonderful for smoothing ganache, for fondant work and stuff like that. So those of you who do cakes, this is really an excellent little product to put your ganache on, or your buttercream, and do different things. Okay, just keep that clean. So then what we're going to do is now we're going to then cover over the largest part of the styrofoam, making sure not to get pleats. So we're going to take your largest part of your styrofoam. Now you can actually just put that onto, like I've got a little silicone mat, I've got a little like ramekin. So you can just put this on the top here, like so. Okay, just make sure that your hands are, dry those, there we go. And then just going to use your, because we don't want to get any pleats on here, see? So you see what I'm doing here is I'm just sort of, you see how I'm just opening this up? I'm just sort of opening up the paste. This would be the same with your air drying clay. Now again, with your air drying clay, just be careful that you don't get, sorry, I've got a little tiny, now if you do get a little pleat there, don't worry too much about it, because you'll be able to sort of smooth it out. And if you do get a little tear, all right, but just roll out your paste. And as I said, if you roll it out to the size you need, that should be, give you the right amount, okay? So just gonna smooth this down. You just need to just work your pleats down. These are going to, the top edge is going to be covered anyway, so don't worry too much about that. All right, and then what you do is you're just going to just take this and you're just going to push your paste just like this, all right? So you're making almost like a wonton. And then you're going to use your little scraper, all right? Now this is just where you're, of course, like with air drying clay, I would suggest using your white glue where we use the piping gel. But just try and get rid of like any little particles you have. Of course, if you're using white styrofoam, you're not going to notice those anyway. Okay. And then you can just use your little, so we're going to use this like a little smoother. Okay. So you can actually just hold that with your cosmetic sponge. And you see, this is wonderful. So as I said, I've been using this on a lot of my different things I've been doing with covering cakes. But it's wonderful as a sort of a fondant smoother for ganache and all sorts of things. So you can use this for, as I said, as a smoother. So I'm just going to go around your edge here. There we go. So this is going to give me so this will be the sort of the main part of the vase, all right? So I'm just going to put that to one side. Okay, and then once you've done that, you're going to then take the remaining 1/3. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave this part here. And so I'm going to just take really like the other piece, which is fresh. Because we'll use this for sticking the vase together and things like that. All right, so now we're going to then do the same with the remaining third. So then this is going to be rolled out to about 14 centimeters, about 5.5 inches. And repeat the process on the base, okay? So again, we're just going to put a little bit of cornstarch down. Just going to roll this out. But remember, once you roll, when you are rolling out paste, just like when you're doing pie dough or pastry, you're going to sort of roll this out, but you're going to then just going to use your rolling pin like this. You're just going to go back and forward like this, you see? So I'm not letting, and what that does, it stretches out but keeps it even in size. All right, so it's going to make this, so it's going to give us a big enough piece here. So you see this wants to be about, this one wants to be about 14 centimeters, about 5.5 inches, okay? So remember, I'm just using my little ruler like I did the other day, but because this is your rolled side, this is your smooth side. And the other thing is of course, a lot of people use a fondant smoother like this to polish their fondant. But the thing is, you can, of course, when you use this technique, it will do the same thing. It gives you an even thickness there. Okay? All right, so we're going to turn this over. And again, we're going to put a little bit of piping gel. You can also use, if you've got your piping gel in a squeeze like this, you can just put a little bit of piping gel onto there. Just drizzle that on. But corn syrup, remember, works well. Honey, like in my... when I teach in Asia, they don't generally use piping gel. If you get a little bit too much, you put it back in the pot. So I use in Asia and in some of the places I teach, like in India, when I'm teaching a lot of pastry schools and things, I use nappage. So nappage is actually like a glaze you'd use for a fruit tart, like a strawberry or raspberry tart. So basically, it's all sort of similar. Piping gel, corn syrup, honey, nappage, they're all sort of going to give you the same sort of thing, and they're going to make it stick. And so then when we do this part here, so then we're going to, roll that out, and then you're going to then repeat the process on the base, okay? So you're going to now take the base part here. So again, just showing you that again. This is just usually the easiest way to do this, all right? So that and then remember, you're going to get a little bit of stickiness on your hand, so going to take and then you can just get rid of the little creases on here. So you see how I'm just opening this up, just bringing this down like this. All right, and then once you get that sort of down towards the bottom, remember at this point here, you need to then take try and get rid of those little crumbs, okay? Now turn this over. So remember, you're just going to bring this all up onto the top so it doesn't fall down. Okay, like this. And then you're going to just trim off your excess, okay? All right. And again, we're going to just take so using your little smoother, okay? Again, you can use your So you see I'm using my little smoother, my little flexi scraper. So this works really, really good for this, all right? So that's going to go to one side. So now what we're going to do is going to take the paste that's left. All right, so just going to take the paste that's left, just going to combine that together. Now, of course, this might have some little particles of styrofoam in, but this is, of course, you're not going to sit and chomp your way through the vase. So the thing is it's not, but as I said, it's just unfortunately with styrofoam like this. Now, I will tell you, if you have a hot wire cutter, like we use here, a hot wire cutter for cutting sort of foams and things like this, but it's a bit bulky to bring into set. But if you use a hot wire cutter, the advantage of a hot wire cutter, it almost like cauterizes the foam. So it almost like melts the surface, so you won't get as much problem. And they said you can buy little battery operated ones or electric wire cutters. Now, so what we're going to do now is going to take the remaining, roll out half of your leftover paste to 9 centimeters, 3.5 inches. Okay, so now we're going to then just going to give that a little knead. So what I'm doing here is I'm sealing the base of this, all right? So I'm going to seal the base of it. So this wants to be about 3.5 inches, 9 centimeters. There. All right, so I know that's going to be fine. There we go. All right. Now you want to use, I'm going to use a piece of paper. All right, so I'm going to use just a little piece of parchment paper or just regular paper is fine. Just turn this over. And then what we're going to do is, and then apply piping gel to the paste. So we're just going to put just a little bit of piping gel onto here. So remember, I use the piping gel in a larger, and then this is a smaller needle tip applicator. This is the one I use for my glue for my air drying clay as well, okay? Okay, now, so what we're going to do now is, so we're going to place the base on top and trim the edge to seal the base using a 6-inch, 15 centimeter skewer pressed in a little to stop it sliding around. So I'm going to use, this is just a 15 centimeter 6-inch kebab skewer. You know, most like Asian grocery stores, you can buy kebab skewers for like sauteing things in different sizes. So I use the small, I have like 5-inch, 6-inch, 7-inch, 8-inch ones. So I'm just going to cut around here. This just sort of stops it sliding around, that's all. And having this on the parchment paper just makes it a little bit easier to handle that. Now, piping gel doesn't affect the paste in any way, so you can just put that back into the bag, okay? So again, then I'm going to just take my little skewer here, and you see I'm just going to, with my skewer, I'm going to use that just to hold it. You can also, if you don't have a little mini knife, you can actually use your little flexi scraper also to clean that edge off, okay? So you see how we've covered the bottom of this, all right? Because this will be like and so from a point of view, if you were doing this air drying clay, it means it seals it all. And of course, just like we talked about the other day with flower pots, you could also put like the little felt pieces on the bottom there, the little silicone or felt stick-on feet you can buy, you know, to stop it scratching. But obviously this wouldn't scratch because it's not like a clay vase, a clay flower pot. I'm just going to pop that to one side. So now I'm going to take about a number 7 size of covering paste. So I'm going to just take my size guide. So I'm just going to use a small piece of paste here. Just about a number 7 is going to be enough here. So about number 7. And then I'm going to take a little bit of piping gel. So we're going to then mix some piping gel into this. For air drying clay ADC, use water or glue. So you could either just use a little bit of water or a little bit of glue into your air drying clay. But you know, as I said, this could be done in all sorts of colors. You know, remember, you could paint it gold or silver. You can sponge it. You can do it like, as I said, think of it like painting like on china. So you can do all sorts of things with this. And so using this concept, you could actually make like a little teapot. You know, you could use like a ball, but use more of it. And your little base, you could make like a teapot, and then you could have flowers in the top of it. You know, so you could do all sorts of things. You can make teacups with flowers in them. So, you know, it's just an alternative to using, obviously, a real one. But it's nice to make it all handcrafted. So then what we're going to do is going to then spread thickly in the center of the base, not too close to the edge. So I'm just going to place that into the middle here. This is going to be quite thick, because what we're also going to do, this is just going to help to level it out as well, okay? So once you get that into the center part there, just going to take the base here. I'm going to put this on the top. All right, so you're going to put this on the top, and then you're just going to like level that out. All right, so you can see in front camera. So you're just going to just sort of level that out. If you want to get extra, you can use a spirit level. Also on most iPhones, you can do like the level app as well, which I use when I set up cakes. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to, once you get that level, I'm going to just push the skewer through just until it comes down to the bottom there. All right, so we have now like a vase kebab, okay? And that's ready for drying. Now, so then what you would do is you then would allow this to dry, okay? So allow to dry, then decorate as desired using Katie Sue Design Flower Pro molds with Wedgwood theme in white. So you can either use flower paste, you know, like you could then make little flowers. So for example, with the Ultimate Filler Flower, which I'm going to talk about this on the pressed sugar, but you could make like little flowers. You see, you could use with those. You could also use modified fondant for non-floral items. You know, like for example, if you were going to use some like the Creative Cake system, like the Rose Medley, the Rose Garland Medley, you could use that. You could do lots of different, as I said, types of decorations with the different Katie Sue molds. And then you can adapt the theme of the molds based on your colors. Let's say, for example, you were doing this in a pale aqua color. You could use seashells around it. You could use obviously like the seahorses. You could use some of the, you know, the different Katie Sue molds for themes like a beach wedding. So there's lots and lots of fun things you can do there. And then of course you could sponge it. You could do airbrushing. You can make it in yellow or gray, then paint silver or gold. And then you're going to use a strip of molded element around the top. So just like we did for the basket, you always want to have a recess to put either your moss or some paste in there to arrange your flowers. So you're not going to see all the wires going into the top. But I'm going to show you how to do the sort of like the Jasperware look, all right? So, so if you come over to here, all right? So basically onto the next sheet there. So it talks about the color. It also talks about variations. So another, like here on this black and green cake, that actually was made as an urn shape. So what I did there is I actually used an egg shape. I just didn't have one to show you the actual egg, but all you do there is you just buy a styrofoam egg. You can get these in all different sizes. So rather than using part of, say, a 4-inch ball and a 3-inch ball as I've done today, you would just use one egg. And you cut off the top and you cut off the bottom. And then you would then follow, so here, for example, you'd use a 10 by 15 centimeter egg, which is 6 by 4. And then you're going to cut off to the base, and then 4.5 centimeters, 1 3/4 inches from the top. And you see then that becomes then the base, you see? So basically that just sits here like so. So you have, and this would give you a more of an elongated, I had one of those, sorry, just, I'll find it in a second. I've got that base, but it just gives you it just gives you a taller base, all right? So it's just gonna, whereas the posy bowl is more squat, this would give you more of an urn shape, okay? So for certain things, like for certain designs, this gives you more depth. And especially if you have flowers that are like long stem flowers, you know, this gives you a little bit more depth to be able to insert the flowers in, all right? So anyway, so that's obviously like if you were using, if you were doing that. And then, for also other things you can do is you can use obviously like styrofoam blocks, bricks and rounds to create decorative planters. So, you know, again, using, for example, the wood grain effect, you could do like a planter with succulents in it. You know, you can use little round ones as like for planters. You could do like a window box type of effect. Like Chrissy, our design team, did with the succulents in. You know, these are also like, these are things you can buy pre-made. These are actually dummy cupcakes. So these actually could be used for the base of a vase. All right, so you can mix and match things. But you can play around with parts from your cones. So like, for example, you could use, this is part for your cone, and you see then this is like a dummy cupcake, so you have a vase, you see? So there are, so things you can mix pre-cut items, and then obviously things you can buy in different shapes. All right, so that will give you that part there. Now, So that gives you various decorations. When you make the decorations, you're going to either modify fondant, all right, by mixing 115 grams of white sugar paste rolled fondant with 1/4 teaspoon of Tylose and 1/4 teaspoon of vegetable shortening, or alternatively you can use 50-50 paste. This would be for a sugar one, where you use equal parts flour gum paste and sugar paste, all right? So you could either take your like Tylose homemade paste or commercial gum paste, flour paste, and mix it with commercial rolled fondant or sugar paste, all right? So when you're generally working with molds, for example, things like the lace or pearls or that, you're normally either going to use 50-50 or modified fondant. So when we do this week we've got another little bundle, which is going to include this is the lace mold, all right? This is the lace I used, and this is the Cameo. And these both fit in really nicely with that Wedgwood, as I said, Wedgwood theme. So we do have these as a bundle offer on the shop, all right? So this is very similar to last week when I showed you the rope on the basket, all right? So this has got the large, medium, and small, all right? And so this would be the same way as we would do the medium rope, all right? This is going to be the size sausage we're going to mold, which is, remember, a poly-dowel size, all right? So that's what I've used for this rope. Now, this mold is quite thick, all right? So what I found is as you'll see when I do this, I lay the sausage of paste in there, and then I push the paste into the points with my Dresden tool. So overall it's not going to be quite as heavy looking. So we're actually making it a little bit thinner on the tips here and a little bit thicker there. Now this is my paste. So I've already modified this, all right? So this has already been modified. So this is, as I said, I've pre-modified this. So this is the 115 grams of the fondant or sugar paste, and then 1/4 teaspoon of Tylose, 1/4 teaspoon of vegetable shortening. Now here, you can make this and leave this and use it whenever you need to. When you're covering the vase, all right, so when you're covering the vase, I generally add the Tylose and then cover it straight away if you're doing a sugar one, because it's going to have the same sort of softness that normal paste will. But what it means is because of the Tylose added to the blue paste there, the air is going to start to dry that, and it will sort of, it will dry more quickly. So this is a number 13 size, so just like I showed you with the modified brown from the basket. So this is pretty much the same technique, all right? We're going to take this, and then I'm going to roll this into a sausage. So we're going to use a number 13, and then use the poly-dowel as with the basket episode for the medium rope. So just roll this to the basic sort of approximate size you need it. Now this is not an infinity edge mold, so you could, but it's a little difficult to line this up. So generally I do this just in sections, but because the fact of the way this is made, it just joins really, really easily. All right, so you're just going to take your paste here. A little bit skinny. There we go. There we go. All right, going to roll that through, and then you're just going to take your paste, and you can put just a little tiny bit of shortening in there, just a little tiny bit on your finger if you need to. All right, and then what I'm going to do here is going to take my cosmetic sponge. You see, and I'm just going to press in with the cosmetic sponge. It's going to give you a little bit longer than you need, all right? But you see how I'm just going to bring this in with the cosmetic sponge, and then with your Dresden tool, what I'm going to do there with the Dresden tool, I'm pushing that. You see how I'm just pushing that into the tips of there like so, you see? So it's going to actually be a little bit thinner on this edge part here, because I found that if you, I won't do the whole thing, but just to show you this, all right? But you're just going to press this in, then just as you go, all right? So just going to come down here. So just going to spend a couple of minutes on that. So you're almost like, pulling the paste down, and then you can just go in with your cosmetic sponge and just sort of push that in just to make sure it's like level. And if you do have any areas that look a little bit thin, you can just patch that with a little tiny piece of paste. But just make sure that you get that right into that inside part. Now you're just going to just make sure that you clean the edges off here, okay? And then again, you're just going to turn this over. So whenever you're removing things from a mold, the way I always do this, just turn this over like this, and I just use my thumb on top. So I just press my thumb on top like that. So you see this will come out from the mold. By doing that, you're not going to stretch and distort the paste, all right? But you see, this is going to give you this really beautiful, can we come in a little tighter, Scott?
Come in?
Yes, just a little bit, thank you. So you can see here, you can see that it has a very nice, the lace is really, really nice, okay? Now, so when you're doing this, so the thing is, of course, you would leave this to dry because I'm going to sort of show you how to finish off the next one. Now, so what you do is you would generally you just decide where you want the front to be, all right? So you're just going to decide where you want the front to be. So you can put a pin here or a toothpick or something like that. So like, let's say that's going to be your front. So you know that is your front. So what we would do there is you would take your strip here and then you would put piping gel onto this, okay? So you just would put some piping gel, just some little dots of piping gel along here. So as I said, you know, I rushed that a little bit, but just make sure you put, you know, just before you take it out of the mold, just make sure you patch it. There are any little areas where it's a bit thin. And you see then what you would do is you take this. So when you're doing something like this, it's like when we cover a cake. A lot of times we will start with things at the back, but if you start at the back of the vase and you come around here, it means, especially if you're doing a longer project, it means you could end up with a seam right on the front, okay? So if this is the front of your, could we come into front camera please, Scott? If this is your front of your vase, can we come in a little bit tighter as well? Thank you. So if you come in, Scott's just going to come in with the camera a little bit. Here we go. Sorry, we're just going to adjust the camera so we can just see here. All right, so you see what you do is, so you take your strip here. So if this is the front, then you'd actually put this onto the front like this, you see? So it will come around here. So what it will then do is you're just going to put this on, with your cosmetic sponge like that. But what it actually means is then you have at the back here, then you repeat that, and then you can fill in the back part, but that ultimately will be the back, okay? Because it just, as I said, if you really have a defined front and back, you want to make sure you don't have a seam right at the front. So you see right at the front there would be where ultimately it's going to look the best. So you just fill this off. And of course, when you do that, you might luck out and it will be exactly the length you need. But if not, you can just trim a little bit off of each end, all right? So that's sort of how you would do that part of the vase. We can readjust the camera now, thanks. All right, so you would do this around the bottom, all right, and you'd also do this around the top. Now, when I did this around the top, of course, again, I've just elevated this up a little bit so you have that rim, because remember, you're going to put a pad of green paste normally in the top of this, all right, to arrange your flowers in. And so you do that around the bottom and you do that around the top. And then, of course, where you have the seam, there, I've just used some white royal icing and I've just filled that in with some white royal icing. Okay, now I'm going to show you now how to use the Cameo mold, and then you're also now going to use the Cameo mold, and so you would then also add a small rope using a kebab bamboo skewer around the middle of the vase. So here I'm using, actually, this is the mold we used last week, all right, in my basket episode. But what you would do there is, rather than making it the thickness we did, which is this, I've just used a bamboo kebab skewer size, all right? So what you'd actually do, so it really is not going to fill the mold up completely, all right? So you're making a thinner sausage, and what you actually do there is you'd put that around the middle of the vase, okay? Now, easiest way to do that, again, is just to do this when you're doing this onto the cake. You're going to do that on the side. So the easiest way to do there is just to sort of, you just would literally put your vase on the side and you're just going to put your sausage around and push it in with your cosmetic sponge. And I just added a little knot there. So on that rope mold, which we didn't use, you're just going to fill that up with paste and just trim off the excess to put like a little knot there, okay? So that would be how you'd use. And then for the Cameo, when we actually do the Cameo here, I'm going to use the Katie Sue Cameo mold. So this is, obviously gives you a beautiful Cameo. Now, Katie Sue have several molds that would work well for Wedgwood. This is another one. If you were doing more of an urn type of vase, this is a beautiful one here. And because this looks like a sort of an English vase, and then you can actually do flowers coming out from here. So if you had a taller vase, this is a nice one to use as well. So that one is, that's called the, pots and urn silicone mold, right? Remember, that's not on the club shot because I'm not actually using it, but just showing you some of the things you may already have, okay? But when we do the Cameo, this also has a frame. I'm not using the frame just because I don't have such a big area, but I'm using just the Cameo. But these are really lovely to make brooches with. In air drying clay, you could actually make handmade brooches from those. So when we make the Cameo, we're going to measure a number 6 size ball of paste. Okay, so we're going to take a number 6 and press into the figure part of the Cameo. So we're going to use, again, just going to take just a little tiny bit of vegetable shortening here. You're going to take a number 6. But this is how you do two-tone effect, all right? So when you're doing some of the Katie Sue molds, this is how we actually do that sort of two-tone concept, all right? So just going to put a little bit of cornstarch onto that, and I'm just going to press this into the, so I'm actually pressing this into the head part here, and then I'm going to press this into the bottom. I'm going to use my little Dresden tool here just to push this in. All right, so what we're doing here is we're filling. Now this is not going to fill it up level because if you're familiar with Cameos, you know, it almost has a translucent effect because a lot of times they're out of like shell and things like that, mother of pearl and things. So you don't want to make it sort of too. So I'm not actually filling it to the top. So that's why I found a number 6 works really well. But just make sure you stay within the, so you've actually filled up the white here, okay? Could we come in a little tighter, Scott, please? Thank you. I'm going to put a little bit of, excuse me, let's get my brush here, a little bit of glue. So I'm just going to take a little tiny bit of glue here. So then you're going to put just a little bit of piping gel, just lightly. Now what this means, this is going to make it stick. Now of course air drying clay you don't have to do anything, but I just put a little tiny bit of piping gel. You could use edible glue there as well, just to make the Cameo sticky. And then we're going to take some of your blue. So we're just going to then measure off, then we need a number 7 size of the blue or whatever color you want to make your Cameo in. All right, so it's going to be number 7 of blue. And then just going to roll this into a little sausage here. Just come on, I've got a little bit closer in the camera here just so you can sort of see it, and then I'll come out a little bit in a second. Just going to press this in. You see, then you're just going to press this into the back. I'm not filling this up to the top completely, and that's where I use the size guide a lot so that you don't, so things are not quite as thick. But just going to just press this in with your cosmetic sponge. So see, then when you take your Cameo out, you see you'll have your beautiful Cameo here like this, you see? And but if you do that correctly, you won't have any like over fill or anything like that. You're going to get your Cameo. Now, so what we do there is you're going to take the Cameo. I'm going to put just a little bit of piping gel just on the back of this. So just going to put just a couple little spots of piping gel, of course, like some glue onto here as well. And then you take your vase. Now, I've already got 3 Cameos on here, all right? But what you basically do is you're going to put the Cameo. So what I actually did when I did this, I used 4 pins. So I put a pin here, one directly opposite, one here, one here. So like at 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock. And then that means that they've divided it into 4. Of course, you don't necessarily have to have the Cameo in all 4 places. And you're going to put the Cameos onto the side here, like so. So you see that will give you your little Cameo on the side there like so. So you see that's going to give you a Cameo. Now just be careful it doesn't roll off, and that's why we're using a convoluted foam. Okay, so you can put your 4 Cameos on, and then if you want to let those dry a little bit, you can do. And then we're actually going to take going to use your small rope from the basket episode. So we're going to use that small rope, but we're actually going to roll out using your companion tool. So we're going to take some white paste here, and so we're going to measure a number 6 size piece of paste, of white paste, and using the companion tool as your guide. So you're making a really, really thin sausage, and this is showing you how you can actually use these to make all different size trims as well. Now an alternative to this would be to pipe around here. So if you've, in fact, when I did this on my wedding cake class, the students actually piped around there. They just did it in white, but they actually piped around that with royal icing, with little dots of royal icing, and then these ribbons were piped. But I'm just showing you sort of things related to your products you have already as well. So it just shows you other ways of using this. But so you're going to take your number 6. All right, we're going to just condition this with a little bit of vegetable shortening here. And then we're going to take your sausage. All right, and we're going to use the same concept. So here we're actually going to use your little companion tool in the same sort of way. You see, I'm making this just really, really thin sausage, you see? All right, and this thin sausage, and this wants to be, this thin sausage wants to be about 10 centimeters, about 4 inches. So we're nearly there. Okay, so you're going to make that into a thin sausage, but it's actually like the size of the companion tool. There we go. This will give you a little bit more than you need anyway. All right, so about 4 inches, about 10 centimeters. But so this is something you have to do. It's a little bit of a process, you know, so you need to, what I did is when I made my vase, I just put it in the food dehydrator, just left it overnight to dry totally, and then, because you're not going to then mess it up. And then you see what you then do, you're going to put these little dots of piping gel around the edge of this. So I'm just going to put some little dots of piping gel around the edge. And then you're going to take your, so here we're going to pop so we're going to use that smallest cavity. You see this sausage is going to be a lot smaller than we've used other sausages. And then you see then I'm just going to press this in with my cosmetic sponge. And if you want to, you can just take like a kebab skewer and just sort of gently press it on top, just to make sure that it's sort of, because you're obviously it's quite deep in there, so just to make sure that's attached into the bottom. And then we're just going to take that out. So you're going to get your little rope. And then what I did is I put the rope around here. All right, so just want to just have it so it comes to the bottom. And then what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to use my, you see how you've got the rope, you've got the little lines of the rope. So I'm actually going to use that as a guide. So I'm actually, rather than cutting straight, I'm just going to actually cut at an angle. And then you see your rope will come around here, and then this one will just be cut again at the angle there, and they would just come to meet here like so. You see? So that's sort of how you would use the rope mold, but without having like really like, because if you cut straight, you're going to have a seam there, okay? So you're just going to cut at an angle, and that just comes around there like so. All right, and then sort of that is sort of basically your vase. So coming in front here, there we go. So you can see here you've got your vase here. So of course this could be then, you know, everything is and then you would again, just like I showed you on the basket, when you're ready to then arrange your flowers into here, what you would do is you take your green paste, all right, so you take your green fondant, you put your green fondant on the top, and then what you'd actually do is then texture it, all right. But if you're going to put this onto a cake, just like I showed on the basket, what you can actually do there is you can push your skewer through here, all right, then you put it on top of the cake. So I'm just going to use this as an example. You put it onto a piece of styrofoam or whatever, go in about 2 inches into there, cut that off, okay, so cut that off with your scissors, and then you do your moss on the top. And then just like I showed you the other day on the basket, it then means you could literally take this off of the styrofoam, the little spike will go into the cake, and then when it comes off the cake, it'll go back in here for delivery. When you're ready to display it, just cut off the bamboo skewer, or you even will be able to just pull the bamboo skewer out, okay? But that just gives a little bit of stability on top of the cake. So that is how we would do the vase. And, you know, it's a really beautiful way to display your as I said, your sugar flowers or your air drying clay flowers, and of course making this all in air drying clay. But also it means if you're doing this for a gift for somebody, you could actually use their favorite china pattern for the actual vase, you know, and as I said, you can do lots of fun things in addition with that as well. So that is how we would do the vase, all right? So next I'm going to move on to show you, next the flower pot, all right? So flower pot, so what I've actually done here is the flower pot I'm showing you is actually made from the next part up from with our topiary, all right? There's also the little small piece on the top. So when you're doing the topiary shape, the cone shape, this is what we use for the basket topper, and then this is the next part up, all right? So that's what I'm using for this. But of course you can make a bigger flower pot or you can make a smaller flower pot as well. But flower pots are really useful. Now you can also do this as a cake, all right? Now a regular flower pot, when you buy a flower pot, a new flower pot, all right, you can obviously bake these in the oven. That will sterilize them. So you wash them, you sterilize them by baking them in the oven. And then what you would need to do is you need to line the flower pot with parchment paper. So those of you familiar with when you line for making a fruit cake, you do a round circle and a strip of paper with little tabs on it. And you'd line that with parchment paper. You then bake your cake in the flower pot. You can buy online glazed flower pots, which actually are glazed on the inside, where people make bread in them. So they actually make like bread in flower pots. So you could do that. Alternatively, you of course could also just cut out, make a sort of a square cake, cut it in with rounds, and then just sculpt, just using a sharp serrated knife, sculpt it into a flower pot shape. But a lot of people make flower pots cake. In my one of my early books, this was actually my third book that I wrote, Sugar Flowers from Around the World. But in here, this is actually, I made this for the photo shoot, and this was actually a real cake. So I actually made that as a sponge cake, and what I actually did there is I baked the cake in a terracotta flower pot with parchment paper inside, and I then used the terracotta colored sugar paste. I used chocolate cookie crumbs for the dirt, and then I made African violets. And funny story, my grandmother and grandfather came to stay. I was actually in Australia at the time on this book tour. My grandparents came to stay, and I had this in my house, and they actually watered it because they thought it was a house plant. They were watering my other plants, so when they came back it was all melted and awful looking. But that actually is and that's a really fun way to do a cake for somebody, because if you made this actually little flower pot like this as a cake, that's a perfect size cake. Somebody in the office or a neighbor or friend or get well or whatever, you just make a little cake like this, and then you put a little straw in there, and you just put like your little pansy, or air drying clay or sugar pansy, or any of those flowers that would grow in a flower pot. It's a really, really fun way to do just like a little cake for somebody, where you actually make a cake flower pot and then you cover it with fondant. And as I said, like here in the United States and in the UK, you can get them now, Oreo cookies, which are a chocolate cookie with like white buttercream inside them. You can buy boxes of just Oreo cookie crumbs, or you can also just scrape out the buttercream and crush them like you would for a chocolate base for a cheesecake, and use that as the dirt, okay? Now, as far as the flower pot, so we're going to use obviously I'm using here the top parts from episode 20, and I've cut this to 6 centimeters, 2.25 inches tall. I take 130 grams, 4.5 ounces of rolled fondant, or 40 grams of air drying clay, and you're going to use this in a terracotta color, which I have here. So terracotta, I just used some brown and some orange, so I've made this like a terracotta clay color. Of course, you can also, like if you're good with an airbrush, you could of course airbrush this as well, but I've just made this in the 130 grams. So we're going to roll out a quarter of the paste, then spread with a little piping gel, okay? So just going to roll this out. And so then I'm going to just take a quarter of this. So it's going to take about a quarter of that piece there. Now this one is going to be a little bit different because I'm going to do the bottom first. Okay. Now this is just straight fondant. I haven't put any of the tilers in here because usually you don't need this. But if your fondant still feels soft, you can do. Okay. We will add a little bit of Tylose powder for the rim, but I'm just using, because if this was done on a cake, you would just use this straight paste. All right, because it's going to stay softer to obviously be able to eat. All right. So you're going to roll this out. And then you're going to, once we've done that, going to roll this out like so. Okay, going to roll this out. And so you're going to roll out a quarter of the paste, then spread with a little piping gel. And for air drying clay, use glue. Press the narrow end of the cone and cut around. So again, you can do this onto your piece of paper. And you can put a little bit of piping gel onto here. Just what I want to show you how I do is how I do the sort of the top of this. Okay, and then I'm going to just take my narrow end of this, I'm going to put this in. So this is going to seal it. Remember, you can use your little scraper here. As I said, those of you that do cakes and that, this is really great for all sorts of applications. So I'm just going to trim that off just a little bit. All right, so it's going to just give you the base of the flower pot. Okay. All right, then once we've done that, we're going to roll out a quarter. Then you're going to roll out more paste and trim the bottom and right hand side. So you're just going to take the basically remaining paste you can take, just so you've got plenty here. So this is very similar to the way we did the basket. All right, so just going to roll this into a sausage here. So of course you can measure with your when you're doing your flower pot, because you're going to do these can be done of course in different sizes here. So just going to measure approximate length that we need the paste to be about 9 inches, about 23 centimeters. All right, you could do that with a ruler, or you can use like a piece of as I said, string. All right, so much more than I need here, and then we're just going to put a little bit of cornstarch on there. Just going to flatten this down. So this is really just like a smaller version. And of course, if you're doing a smaller basket as well, this would really be like the way you would do it. So I'm using just here a smaller rolling pin, but just like I showed you when we did I'm going to roll this out. Now the thing to remember with when you're working with styrofoam, because styrofoam is got texture on it, you're generally not going to make the paste too thin, okay? And again, see how I'm just going to go rolling back and forward like this. Okay, now remember, just make sure that this is, obviously this is two and a half inches tall, okay? So just make sure it's tall enough. And again, you're going to just cut so then we're going to take so roll out, then you're going to trim the bottom and right hand side. So it's going to cut the bottom here. Right hand side here. I'm just going to flip this over onto your piece of fun foam or your paper here. I'm just going to use it on the board, but just like I showed you last week, you can do that. And then going to put some piping gel onto here. Just going to put a little bit of piping gel. Now, the reason why we don't use egg white here is because, you know, egg white or edible glue doesn't really have a lot of body to it. So you generally need something, as I said, that's sticky with the styrofoam. And, you know, some people use, when they do cake dummies, they use like vegetable fat or like shortening. So that's good like for basic styrofoam shape. So if you were covering, for example, like this to make like a square planter, you could actually just use vegetable shortening on your paste, right? On a cake dummy, this is like smooth. It's actually styrene, which is smooth. And styrofoam, which is what I'm using, it's a little bit more, you know, sort of crunchy and textured. So that's the one you need to use something a little bit stickier on, okay? All right, so then we're going to take, so again, just going to go roll from the bottom here. Now, just like we did last week, because you're working here, just going to roll around here. Just going to just trim the excess paste here. And again, remember, you can do things like this also on your crate foam as well. All right, and then we do, you know, this sort of what we call the common cut is like where you make a cut so that you get a better seam. So you make a cut like this. See, then you're just going to peel away your paste here, and then you're going to open this up, and then you're going to just trim that. And it's going to pop this back down here. So you're just going to get just a nice seam, because this will be filled in with softened fondant, just like we did on the basket. And again, we're just going to then just use if you find it easier, you can put use your bamboo skewer in there as well. But again, you see how I'm just using my little flexi scraper. Now, of course, here, it's not like the basket. You can't really do this with the basket we did last week because, of course, you have all that texture on it. So, but when you have a smooth surface. So again, we're going to now remove the excess paste. Now, of course, for air drying clay, you could totally just buy a clay flower pot but it's nice to, sometimes you might want to do custom size or custom height to a particular project. So now what we're going to do is going to take the paste that's left. Remember, don't worry about the it being a little sticky because you can just work a little bit of shortening into here. Piping gel, as I said, is not affected by it's just going to make it just a little bit softer. And then we're going to, so we're going to take the leftover paste and add a little tilers to tighten it up. Now you won't need all of it, so probably about 3/4 of that. And then what we're going to do is just going to add a little tylose to this just to tighten it up. And that is because when we do the rim of the flower pot, we want to have, we're tightening it up with a little bit of tylose so that basically what happens is that the pot will, the lid will become won't be too soft looking. So here, you're just going to literally just add your tylose. So I'm just doing like a couple of little dunks in there. So you're just literally just modifying a little bit like when we did the vase, all right? So what that's going to do is just going to firm it up a little bit. And then remember, you need to just, using your ruler, you're just going to measure around to see how long that needs to be. All right, so remember this is obviously a little bit thickened, so we needed about 10 inches, about 26 centimeters now. And then I'm going to roll this out. All right, so I'm just going to make this long enough for the project. And I'm just going to then, a little bit of corn flour down here. Just going to flatten this down a little bit here, like this. I'm just going to roll this out. Now I want this fairly thick because this is going to be the rim of the flower pot. All right, so this doesn't want to be too thin, okay? Because you want it like thicker here for the edge. You could use like #1 on the pasta machine, but I'm just rolling this out, as I said, just freehand, okay? But just make sure it's long enough. Now, when you cut this, of course, you could use a ruler, all right? In Sugarcraft, we use this product here. This is called a multi-ribbon cutter. Now, this is an FMM product, so it's something we sell on our website here for those of you in the US. Obviously, you can use your 20% off from the sale as well. In the UK, the FMM products are available in most Sugarcraft online stores. It's called a multi-ribbon cutter, and you can adjust this from really, really thin to a maximum of 5 centimeters wide. It's great for ribbons, and you can also do like rickrack or with the ribbon with the scalloped edges. And you also have little stitch wheels. So when you're doing, like, for example, like leather straps, for say a purse cake, you can actually use that clipped on, or you can clip that onto the little plain disc, and you'll get little stitches, all right? So when you do, like, for example, a sewing basket cake, so I'm just gonna bring this into camera here. Okay, this is fairly old here, but you can see here on this sewing basket cake, but you can see here some of the ribbons, and then, like, for example, the ribbon, the rickrack, which is like the green ribbon or the pink ribbon you see here, that's just done with the scalloped edge. So you can use it, so it's really good for like trim, and then you can see like on the purple ribbons there, you can see those little tiny stitches. All right, so that's using that particular product, okay? And so we're going to use this. And so when I normally do this, what I found, especially if you're doing this on a longer scale, if you just put like a little tiny bit of vegetable fat down, what that does, it stops it rolling up onto the rollers, okay? And then you're just going to just cut this down. So we're just going to come down here. So it should have been a little tiny bit wider there, but that'll be fine. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my Flower Pro Flexi Scraper, and I'm just going to go at an angle like this. And I'm going to go in an angle like this, just to give you that little angled edge. I'm not really trying to cut into there. All I'm doing here is I'm just using this to sort of give you like a slightly rounded edge. So you're just going to use it at a slight angle, see? So you're just going to get that, because a flower pot has a little bit of a rounded edge onto there, and the same onto there, okay? Now when we put this onto here, I found this is a good little tip, and this is also will work on the vase as well. So what I'm going to do is you're going to take I'm using just a little silicone mat. I'm going to put a cosmetic sponge onto here. So I'm just elevating this. You could use like a lid. So this is something approximately about 5 millimeters or so thick. All right, I'm doing a little lid. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the flower pot upside down onto that. Okay, so what I've done is I've elevated it. Okay, so there's actually, so the cosmetic sponge you can see is there. And then what we do here is we're going to then take a little bit of piping gel, and it's going to put a little bit of piping gel. So I'm just going to put a little bit of piping gel. So you're going to just put the piping gel around the, so you're going to brush a little piping gel around the base of the pot. So you can just brush, or you can use like but you can also use like your brush. So I'm just going to do that around the very, very bottom of the pot with the piping gel. And then you see what we do is then so of course you need to make sure where your seam is, because you'll have the back seam and that together, which is here. But what we then do is you put this on like this. So you see how you're actually going to do that. So we're just going to go around the flower pot here like so. But you see what we've done, because we've elevated the flower pot with the piece of sponge, but you could just use like a little plastic lid, just sort of something that you think is going to give you the right sort of recess. And then you can use a pair of scissors or a knife, and you can just trim the other end of that. All right. So just make sure that that's attached. But then you see when you flip this over, okay, see what it's going to do is going to give you a perfect, it's going to make sure the top is level, and it's going to give you a perfect rim there to put for your flower pot, all right? And you can use the same sort of technique that we used. Take a cookie cutter. You could just use like a cookie cutter or a jar, and you're just going to go round like that, just to make sure that you get that nice and round. All right, and that would be basically your flower pot, okay? And then all you do with the flower pot, you're going to let it dry like I showed you last week, so I'm not going to show you that again. But like I showed you last week, now remember we've got, this is the fondant I have left from the band, so that, remember, is modified. So that's got a little bit of Tylose into it, all right? And then we have a little bit of the original sugar paste roll fondant left. So you're just going to add a little bit of water to that, and you just will fill in the seam at the back. And then you can do, of course, you can use the paste. I've just used the brown version of what I showed last week in green. So I've just used my, as I said, green brown fondant in there, textured it with your calla lily. I've then added the little bit of brown with some vodka just to paint that to look like dirt. Alternatively, you could also use, if you're doing this in air drying clay, you could put some glue in there. You could sprinkle some sand in there, some colored sand, and then that could be used for, like, say, a succulent, if you're doing a succulent, or you know, cacti or something like that, which would be fun to do. You could do that as an alternative. So actually in your photograph there, you can see in the photograph that's actually like green sand, okay? It's like a pot filler. But and then when you finish the flower pot, you would just, once we've done that as the basket topper, you then dust with orange-brown mixture to give some shade in, and then you lightly steam, okay? So what you can do there is you can actually just put that, and I've just put a little bit of brown, and then you're just going to very, very lightly steam it, and it will just give it that like natural look. I wouldn't put spray lacquer on it because to make it too shiny, but if you dust it with a little bit of brown, like almost like highlights, a little bit of brown and orange, and you just steam it, and then obviously just leave it to dry. That would be how you'd make a little flower pot, but that would be really adorable. You know, when you get time to make your pansies, you could put a little pansy in there. It would be a really nice one to use, all right? So that is how you would use the that do the little flower pot. All right, and just remember, if you have any questions, you just put those in the thread. Anything you didn't understand or anything, but just remember that I haven't been so specific. I mean, I've given you the amount of paste for that next size up on your from your basket, but of course if you're doing flower pots in different sizes, once you've done them a couple of times, you'll get to know how much paste you would need. Now I'm going to finish off by showing you how to make, and then also the other thing I wanted to mention is you can also use like some of the Katie Sue molds. Scott, could I just ask you a question? Could you bring me over the cookies, the terracotta pot cookie with the rose garland on? Now it does talk in there about, just going to show you on a cookie, but like using, for example, Kerry's creative cake system, you can use, for example, like the garland, the rose garland one, that can be used for the, so I'm just going to show you here. Thank you, that's great. So you see this is a cookie, so this was actually from Cookie Con, so I did like an English tote garden theme. But here you see I've done actually like a flower pot. This is made with a basket cookie cutter, and then I'd use a paler terracotta color. And then what I actually did, this is one of Kerry's molds. So the paste you made the rim from, which has got the Tylos on, you could use that in the Creative Cake System Rose Medley, and then you could actually attach those to you could do say 3 or 4 of those around your flower pot, and that would give you a flower pot that sort of a lot of, especially the Italian flower pots often have like fleur-de-lis on in France, or you'd have that sort of ornate plaster work. So you could actually apply those to the side of the flower pot as well. So you could make that quite decorative, okay? So it talks about that ideas there, bas relief, and then you could use mixed sugar with colored dust, or you could use obviously like you could use vase filler or sand for cacti and succulents, okay? So if you're making succulents and things, that's a really fun one to do. Now, the last one to finish up with for today's episode is going to be to show you how to do pressed sugar. So pressed sugar is, here in the United States and in some countries at Easter time, we do a lot of like sugar Easter eggs, where basically same concept, you fill an egg-shaped mold up, and then what you actually do is you let it dry a little bit, then you scoop it out and you make a shell, and then you cut off the ends of them, and they make panoramic sugar eggs. So if you do a search on the Google and put in panoramic sugar eggs, you'll see, and they have little scenes inside them. So I've done those a lot. Now, typically when most people do sugar eggs, all right, they're going to use sugar, just regular table sugar, granulated sugar, and then they're going to use, some people use like fresh egg white, some people use meringue powder, some people just use water. Now I use vinegar, all right, so vinegar wouldn't be good to eat, like if you were making sugar eggs for Easter to eat, because obviously it wouldn't taste good, but I use vinegar especially when I do white pressed sugar, so that it stays white, because if you use egg white or you use meringue powder, it's going to go a little bit off white. So in pastry, so like at the French pastry school, when my students do the vase, so actually the vase I'm showing you here is from one of the projects I do with my students. So when they do the pressed sugar vase, they use the sugar and white vinegar, and the white vinegar will keep this really white, all right? But as I said, but some people that do panoramic sugar eggs obviously use other alternative methods. And water I've never found works well, because water almost dissolves it. But as I said, some people use fresh egg whites, some use pasteurized egg whites, some people use meringue powder and water, like making an egg white solution and adding it to the sugar, but it will go yellow. Now, very, very easy recipe, all right? So recipe is on here. So for pressed sugar, you take 250 grams of white granulated table sugar, 9 grams of white vinegar, okay? So we're going to just take my scale here. Now I've already scaled my sugar off, all right? So generally when I'm scaling sugar, I would just put a bowl on, zero out, then I just put in my 250 grams of sugar. So I've already got that. So I'm just going to zero that out. All right, and then we're going to take your vinegar. So I'm going to use here, so this is just white vinegar. Now, if you want to do colored sugar, all right, like for example, you wanted to do pink vase, you wanted to do, I'm actually going to show you a gray vase in a minute. You could just put your gel color or your food color and just put it into the vinegar, all right? So you just put a couple of drops, you could use powder colors, gel colors, give it a shake, all right? and then you're going to, as I said, so you're going to basically make a colored vinegar, okay? With powder, you could add powder into your sugar, all right? But generally when you're using gel colors, I would dissolve those in the vinegar. Now, so what we're going to do here is going to add 9 grams of sugar. So you're going to add vinegar with a spray bottle to get an accurate amount, okay? So what I'm actually going to do here is, now you want to do this in a zip top bag, okay? Because as you'll see, and so literally you're just going to start to just spray the vinegar into your Ziploc bag here. Now really this is very much like making a sandcastle on the beach, all right? What it's going to do is going to, but as I said, the vinegar will keep the, here are so 9 grams of vinegar, okay? This is just like white vinegar, okay? It's out the way. So then what we're going to do is you're going to then just going to shake this. Just going to work this through the vinegar through here. Now of course this is just sugar, okay? Because you know you couldn't put, I don't think air drying clay would work on top of this, but this would be more for those of you that do cakes or things. It's a nice way just to sort of an alternative to make a vase. And what's really nice, you know, when we talked about in our coloring episode, you could add like luster dusts into here. You could put some of like, remember like the sparkle dust, the hologram dust. You just would add those as part of your sugar, okay? But when you color it, you're generally going to put your coloring into your vinegar. Now, of course, if I color this whole amount, then I'm going to waste my vinegar. So what you could do is you could just, you know, also you could just have your, you know, approximately how much you think 9 grams is, and then just mix up that amount. But vinegar is not an expensive product anyway. But you just see, you're just literally making like a damp sand here, okay? So I'm just going to move these out of the way for a second so I can get a little bit of room here just to bring in my other things. All right, so when we are doing this, so then what we're going to do is, so you mix well to create a damp sand consistency. For a solid base, pack like a sand in a bucket on the beach and place a mat, cardboard or piece of card on top and flip over. Now, so you can find all sorts of things around the house. You can find, you know, these are like for, you know, condiments and things like that. This is for a little tart shell. All right, these are just little, you know, like portion cups. You can use cups like this. All right, I've used here, I'm going to talk a little bit about this one in a moment, but as I said, so you can create all sorts of things with this. I'm going to just show you a solid base. This is a little bit messy, all right, but as I said, it's sort of, it's easy to work if you just work on a piece of parchment, and then you can put the, sorry, I'm just getting my little spoon I've got here, which is, there we go. Sorry, I've just lost my little spoon. I had a little green spoon earlier. There we go. All right, so you can use, like, for example, just like a spoon, okay? And then what you're going to do here, now you don't have to do anything to this, but what you want to do is as you start putting the sugar in, you want to pack this down like you would sand, okay? Now another way you can do that is you can also use, like, for example, like this is the bottom of a little shot glass, something like that. You're just going to just sort of pack this in. Okay, and then you can just take your little scraper and you can just do this. Just going to scrape off your excess paste here, like that. You want to just keep this in the bag, okay, because that will stop it drying out. And when you're not using it, you're just going to keep it. And this will keep for several weeks, all right? So you can keep this pretty much indefinite. And even if you do find it gets a little bit dry, just add a little bit more vinegar to it because the vinegar will evaporate. Now, generally speaking, there are several ways to do this. So I've just found my little green spoon. You can use a piece of parchment paper, you could use a piece of card, you could use, like, for example, your little silicone mat like this, anything like this can be used. But what you want to do is you want to put something on here so you can flip it, all right, like this. And then what you do here is you flip this upside down, but it also doesn't really want to be anything that's too flexible, okay? But as I said, so you can put this onto parchment because obviously it's small, but on something bigger you want something a little bit more rigid. And you're just going to take that off and you see how it's going to give you your pressed sugar base, all right? So that would be like how you would just do a solid base. Now, of course, you could do, like this just shows you some examples. So this is what this will look like once it's dry. See, so you get this pressed sugar base. This is, for example, just using a little small tart shell, you see, like this. This is, for example, done in the one I'm going to be showing you, in fact, in a moment, all right? This is just a slightly bigger one than I do with my students at the French pastry school. So that is how you would make the little bases, okay? And let's move those out of the way. So then, next option you have is that then when you, for a vase top where one central wire or wires will go in, repeat step 4, but then before flipping over, insert a large stick or dowel, then place a piece of straw or poly dowel into the cavity and continue as solid base. I'm just going to show you this on the one here. Now, when you do the, on the cone shape, I use 25 grams or a number 13 ball of fondant pressed into a paper snow cone. So what I've done is I've used the shaved ice or the snow cone we're going to talk about next week. I just used the number 13 piece of fondant. I just pushed it into the mold. And I use my rolling pin to press that in, all right? And then what I'm doing, because these are paper, they're not very sort of stable, I've just used another couple of paper cones to secure that. And just put it in a cup. And then what you would do there is you would take your, again, you're going to use that same concept. And as I said, you can of course work on a, on a piece of parchment paper or something, but you see how you're just going to sort of pack the, but like using something like this is good because you can. Now when my students at the French pastry school, when they do this, it's just part of their wedding cake they just do a spray with a single wire, okay? So they're actually, which you can actually see in the photograph on the first page. So this is actually shows you the spray that they do here, all right? So it's actually a spray with gardenias and callies and orchids, but it's wired together in a crescent shape where it has one single stem, okay? Or if you were going to use, I'm going to actually show you on the finished one, I'm going to show you using our air drying clay spray. Now, of course, you can do these with sugar, and then, of course, you could do a sugar vase and then use air drying clay flowers, just like you could do a sugar flower pot and then you could do an air drying clay. But this is also where some of you are a little bit, apprehensive about using air drying clay flowers onto a cake. This is a perfect way to do it because your flowers are just separate from the cake. You see, it's a self-contained arrangement. And then you're just going to just scrape away your excess paste here, like so. All right. And then what I've done here is I'm going to use a sort of a stick. This is a stick here. I'm just going to go into the middle of this. Just going to wiggle that. You can just put that in a little cup or something to hold it. And then you can use, now here you can use, depending on how big. Now, so for example, if you were doing a larger arrangement of flowers or a bigger vase, you could use, something like this size, make your hole, and then this is like a bubble tea straw, okay? These are the poly dowels, remember, these are the ones with the little ribs on them, all right, the poly dowels for doweling cakes, but these are wonderful flowers. But also here you could just use a regular, this is what just could be used like a regular drinking straw, okay, and that's like an in-between. This is also a bubble tea straw. And so what you can do there is you can just put that into there as far as it will go. You can just cut that. All right. And then what you would then do is, again, you just would take like your silicone mat here. Just going to turn this over. And then I'm going to pull the cardboard ones, the two outside ones off. I'm going to pull this out. I'm going to take this out there like that. All right, now don't worry if that's a little bit off because it's not going to matter. I mean, it's just making a hole in the middle, you see? And of course, you can reuse that over and over again. And then you'd put that to one side. Just be careful. And then what I normally do is put these in the food dehydrator. All right, now if you pack something in there, all right, if you pack it, when you turn it out, if you can see it's got like a crack in there, just the easy thing to do is just put it back in the mold, just repack it. You need to pack it nice and tight in the mold, all right? And then the third option would be, like for example, if you were going to do something where you wanted to do more of an arrangement of flowers, where you want to sort of put the wires in individually, not as a group, what you can do there is you can actually do like a hollow inside. So what you would do there is, I'm going to show you here, just using this little cup here, and I've got a finished one behind me on a larger scale. But so what you do there is you would just take your, again, you see, like, and then if you use like a, that works really well just to pack that in, okay? Okay, and then what I'm going to do here, I want to just sort of put the sugar around the side. Now when we do sugar eggs, normally what you do, most people when they make sugar eggs, normally they like make the solid egg, and then they tip it out and you dry it for maybe like an hour, 90 minutes, so the outside shell of the egg dries. Then you turn it back over, you put it back in the plastic mold or the mold you've used, and you scoop out the damp sugar, and you can reuse that. But when I make toppers, I do it a little bit differently, in that I'm going to take, so I'm going to use something small in the inside, all right? So it could be like something, so I'm just going to scoop out a little bit more sugar because I don't need quite as much here. Right, so you could take, this would be your inside vessel. So this means this is going to be the sort of the size of, and then if this was a little bit deep, you know, because these are just like disposable things, you could actually just cut this down. I'm just going to show you here. So you could cut this down to the depth you needed it. Because if you were just arranging like little daisies or whatever, so it really depends a little bit on the size of the flower, because remember, when you're arranging sugar flowers, you need to have enough depth here. But so you see how I'm going to take that, so I can put a little bit more sugar in there, like that. And I'm going to put this, the important thing is this needs to be level with the top. All right, so it needs to be level with the top here, like this. And you're just going to just scoop your sugar. Don't worry if some goes into the little container here, because it's going to just be used as a, you see, so what you've actually done is that you see how I've actually made like an inside part here with this one, all right? And so then what you would do there on this one, you're going to then, where it talks about that on the, then for hollowed out vase, pack the chosen shape with sugar, turn out onto cardboard and let dry until the surface seems dry. And then you're going to then put back in the mold and then scoop out with a melon boiler or a small spoon. So that's one way you can do it. And then what you would then do is you fill the cavity with corn flour, corn starch, all right? So one way to do it would be just literally to do it full, all right? Which, as she said, you do it full like that. So if you were doing the, that's the one that I just made here, all right? So just to show you on this one. So as I said, so one option is you could take this and then like you'd leave this to dry a little bit so the outside dries. Then you go back into here, all right? Then what you would do is you'd scoop this out. And a lot of times I use like a melon boiler. Now you can reuse this soft, because this is still going to be soft, you see. So then you could scoop this out. So this is one option. So see, you could actually make like a posy bowl. So if you use like a sugar bowl, so you could actually make a, so you see how you scoop this out. But generally you want to let the outside really dry. You see, then what you do here is you then take some corn flour. So take, sorry, which is here, there we go. So you're going to take your corn flour, corn starch, and then what you do here is you fill this up. So this is the sort of more of a traditional method like I use for, and now the cornstarch does several things. What the cornstarch does, it actually is going to help to make the whole thing dry, but also it's totally supporting the shape, right? Because if you, remember you're already making like a sugar shell, and if you turn it over and then you don't do that, what will happen a lot of times, it will collapse, okay? Sorry, you can see it's a little bit messy, all right? So it is a little bit messy to do, but I'm gonna move these out, right? All right, and so then what you would do is then you'd put this back on here, turn this over, and you see then you let that dry, okay? So then what that means is this is just showing a little actually the cup one here. All right, so this is dry. So you see, then what you do is turn it back over, and then all you then do is you can reuse the corn flour here. So you can just put your corn flour back into your container here, like that. All right, and then what you would then do is you're just going to just brush out the excess corn flour. And you just spend a little bit of time on that. So see how you've made an open cavity. And then what we would do is then you would take that and you would then fill that with, when you're ready to put your flowers in, you're then going to just fill that with your paste, all right? Going to fill it with sugar paste. And then that will end up being the what you stick the flowers into. And of course you could decorate this as well, which I'm going to bring in my sample ones over here, just so you can see what these look like. But anyway, so that would be sort of how you would do the little this part here. Okay, so that would be how you would do the. And then alternatively, all right, so alternatively a smaller container can be positioned in the top level, and then once flipped over, you can flip upside down, and then you can remove the container. So obviously using this method, you just would flip that because it's got a little container inside, flip it upside down, that's going to support it, let it dry, then you just take the container out, or you can keep the container in there. Because once this is actually dry, you could actually just then fill this up. You could actually just fill this little container up with sugar paste, or if you're doing air drying clay, you could use some clay in there. You could arrange your flowers, then you just take that and you just like putting it into a planter, then you just put that back in the top of your little sugar vase, all right? Or you can remove that and then put that in. Now, first of all, when you're doing, so this is a dry one here, all right? So this is a dry one, so of course you just would make sure there's no sugar blocking that. So this is a dry one here, and this is my dry base. And so when you do these, you can, once we've done those, you can be used an alternative to obviously styrofoam covered with paste. Can be decorated with royal icing as shown. Decorate with royal icing using a grass tip on the top to make grass. Now, so when my students do the topper here for the wedding cake, they're actually using here royal icing. And what you normally do there is you're going to do Corneli lacework. Now, Corneli lacework gets its name from Mr. Corneli, who is a French fashion designer. And so Corneli lacework is technique we use on cake where we do almost like a W and an M shape, like this. It's like a W and an M. All right, and so when you do Corneli lacework, it's like this, and you're actually drawing, and you don't sort of overlap, but you just go, it's like a continuous movement. This is a 1.5 tip with royal icing, and that is like what we call Corneli lacework, okay? So when you're doing this this technique on the vase, now normally I just put this on a turntable to do, but just showing you just a little bit, I'm going to just show, because we're obviously then overhead here, just so you can see the idea. But all you do there is with the Corneli lacework, you're just going to go over the surface, you're just drawing over the surface of this. All right, so you're just going to do that all over the whole vase. Now, of course, if you made this in black sugar, this is going to look really stunning. Of course, you could also make it in different colors as well. So you do that all over. And then on the base part here, all right, what I do there is I'm going to just do like little shell. So I just do like a little shell coming down. So you just generally do like 5 little shells coming down here like that. So I'm just going to do like a little line. And then, so when my students do that, they do this one with it upside down, and they do the base part here. We leave it a few minutes to dry. And then once it's actually been, once it's dry, and then we put it together. And so then you're going to decorate with royal icing. So you then would use, generally, when we do this. Now, there's a couple of things you can do, because you can't really push a dowel through here. So I would generally either make like a little fondant disc, all right? So this would just be, I've just rolled out fondant about 1/4 inch thick, and just cut it out with a round cookie cutter. Or another nice way to do this is you actually make like a little mini, like a mini wedding cake. So this is just literally a little 3-inch round cake dummy. So I've covered this with fondant. I've actually used the Katie Sue lace mold on here. And then what you actually would do is you would you'd build it onto this disc or onto a little mini cake, and then the idea is you just would take this and then just place it on top of your wedding cake, because you don't want to stick this on the top of the cake, because obviously it's going, and then it would also be difficult to put a skewer through this one. All right, so what you'd actually do then is you just would attach that with a little bit of royal icing. So you just would attach a little base like this, and then you'd put royal icing on the top here. And then you see then this one you would position that on the top, like there. There you go. And then round the bottom of this one, all I've done is I've done just like a little, I'm just going to show you here on the green, okay? But I've just done like a little back and forward, like a little rope design. So you're just going to go back, just almost like a zigzag. So you're just going to go like this with your, this is with a number 2. All right, so I just did a number 2, and then I also have done a number 2 shell. So you see I've just done a little number 2 shell on where the 2 pieces meet, all right? And then, but as I said, if you do that on a little plaque or on a little mini dummy cake, then basically your client can just take this whole thing home with the sugar flowers and everything. It's a really cute, like, topper idea, okay? Now, when you're, so this is my back here, so I just know the back. So then when you're ready to arrange the flowers into there, okay, so what you're going to do then, you're going to then, and you could also decorate the top, like a garret frill could be cut out for the top of the vase, or create a rim out of paste. So several options. You could use your mold, like a rope mold around the top edge. Then you could put a pad of green paste in there. Alternatively, like how my students finish off the piece is, I'm going to show you here. This is actually a garret frill. So a garret frill is a round cutter we use for a cake. You can use obviously like a scalloped cookie cutter as well, like this. All right, so what I've done is I've just rolled out some, this is just some modified fondant. I've just rolled this out, and this can, you can do this well in advance, and just put your flowers in. And then I'm just using here a number 5 tip. But you want something that is just a little bit bigger than the top of the vase, all right? So whatever size you make it. Remember, I made this one in the shaved ice cone, okay? And then what you would do is you're going to put a little bit of royal icing just onto here, like that. I'm just going to place this into the top here, like that. So this is going to almost give me a bit like a sort of a lacy doily on the edge. It's just going to feel where my hole is there. All right, so this is going to be where my poly dowel would be, like so. Okay, so that is really like your topper, and then you would just take your flowers. So you see, then you would take your air drying clay flowers, and you see then literally that could just go into the, it's going to be on a pair of pliers. You could take your, so this is just with your air drying clay flowers. I've just added a little an extra rosebud on here, but you're just going to put the air drying clay flowers into there like so, and you see how you'll have this beautiful topper for a wedding cake. See, so that could be as I said, so totally a little bit like the basket, and that totally self-contained. And then that could be put on, as I said, just, and then this whole thing you could just literally place. You don't have to stick it down. You just place it on top of, say, the 6-inch topper wedding cake. And then when that cake's cut, that could just be taken off, and then the client could actually take that home. So it almost looks like a little mini wedding cake. So it's a really cute idea for a cake. It also would mean if you were doing a small, like, anniversary cake, let's say for a 50th wedding anniversary, it's a small cake, then what you could do is you could do this one as a little dummy cake, and then you could have, say, for example, a 6-inch cake, which would be a real cake. If obviously you've only got 12 guests, you don't need a huge cake. So then literally you could just place that on top. So it would look like a little mini 2-tier cake, and then the client could just take this off, and then they could keep the topper with maybe the golden yellow roses, okay? So you can see the Scott's going to come in a little bit tighter here, so you can sort of see, get an idea about like sort of how that would look. All right. So anyway, so that's using obviously the pressed sugar, and you can see this is all decorated with royal icing. Okay, and we'll post some photographs on there. And then this just shows, so this one actually I did in a gray color. So I did this in pale gray sugar. And then what I did is I used, that one was actually just done with this cup. All right, and then what it is, I used this little bowl in the top of it, you see? And so this was done in the technique of just flipping it upside down. And then this one, I've just decorated with the the little flowers, the forget-me-nots from the Ultimate Filler Flower mold. I've used the small rope, the medium rope, the larger rope around the top edge. And then I've used some royal icing. I've done some embroidery on here and some little dots there, just to give you some ideas of variations. So then when you come to arrange the flowers in there, just like in the basket or the posy bowl, when you're ready to arrange the flowers in there, you then just would fill that up with fondant with sugar paste. Of course, you could do that in green, or you could do white and then a green piece on top. And then just like sticking the flowers in the basket, you just will stick your flowers in there. Now just remember, the depth of this is important, okay? Because if, for example, you had something tall, like say a rose, especially if it's made from sugar, it's quite heavy. You need to go down deeper into there, okay? So that's where sometimes you use the scoop out method, or sometimes you use a container. But if you're doing regular size flowers that are, and of course air drying clay is lightweight, so it's not such a problem with weight distribution, because you can't obviously push the wires in further than that. Literally, as I said, you can just fill that up. Or alternatively, looks like I explained, you could actually just fill this up with sugar paste, put some green on the top, arrange your flowers in there, and then you could take that, and then that could just actually sit back into the little cavity that you have in the top of it. Okay? And so that's, as I said, giving you some ideas on pressed sugar. But pressed sugar is really fun because you can do contemporary shapes. You can do, like, for example, vases, can do like cubes. So just make one little hole in there if you're doing a modern wedding cake, modern arrangement. But remember, pressed sugar is really not suitable to use, for example, covering with air drying clay, or putting on, say, a table, or using as a gift idea, because of course if it gets damp it would just dissolve. But for a cake topper, it's a fun idea, and it gives you options, because as I said, you can use cups and bowls and sugar bowls and all different things you have around the house as shapes. So it does give you a little bit more option. It's not quite as limited as the styrofoam. Okay? So anyway, I hope everybody has obviously enjoyed today's episode, obviously showing you the different alternatives on posy bowls. So a couple of things. Remember, with the basket competition, so we do have a basket competition. That is going to be, the closing date of that is Wednesday, July 22nd. All right, so you have about 3 weeks to work on that. And so I'll announce the winners on Thursday, July 23rd. We have, remember, there are 2 categories. We have air drying clay, or we have sugar. So just make sure that when you post, all right, just post it on the platform, on the Facebook group. Just paste where you're from, all right, what it's made from, sugar or air drying clay, plus also the 3 Katie Sue, Flower Pro, NL, Creative Cake System, Sugar Button mold you would like, okay? Because obviously the winner for the air drying clay and for the sugar will each get, as I said, 3 Katie Sue, any of the molds you'd like for, as I said, for your prize, all right? And remember, Monday and Thursday, so next week is Lysianthus, as I said, 2-part class, master class. So Monday we're making the flower centers, the flower petals, the buds, and the leaves. And then next Thursday, finishing off calyxes, coloring, and as I said, finishing off of that. Remember, you have the Lysianthus class checkout list, so that's got all the things if you're wanting to have a go at making that, after the class or sometime next week. And then after the second part, can finish that off. And so you've got all of the supply list there of what you would need to make the Lysianthus, all right? And remember, that's all that information. If you do have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, all right? And those of you here in the US, happy 4th of July, and have a safe holiday weekend with family and friends. Remember to wear your masks, okay? And but anyway, stay safe, everybody. Until Monday, have a great week and weekend, and I'll see you soon. Sweet wishes. Bye.